The emergency room lights flickered at 11:47 p.m. when a 220-pound Navy SEAL hit the floor of Raven Creek Military Medical Center's trauma bay like a man who'd already decided he was dying. His hand grabbed the nearest wrist. Not a doctor's, not a surgeon's, a nurse's. His eyes found hers through the blood and the chaos and the screaming monitors, and he pulled her close enough that only she could hear what he said. 4 words. Just 4. But they stopped her cold. They're already inside. Go. And the nurse everyone had spent 6 months ignoring? She already knew what to do. If this story grips you, I want you to follow me to the very end. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift started the way most Thursday night shifts started at Raven Creek Military Medical Center. Understaffed, underfunded, and running on burnt coffee and collective exhaustion. Seattle's November rain hammered the windows of the trauma wing with the kind of persistence that made you forget there was ever a world without it. The hallways smelled like antiseptic and old floor wax, and somewhere on the second floor, a cardiac monitor had been beeping out of rhythm for 40 minutes because the tech assigned to fix it had called in sick. Emily Carter noticed the beeping. She noted the time. She put it on the list she kept in her left breast pocket on a folded square of paper, the same way she cataloged everything that needed fixing in this building, quietly, without announcement, without expectation that anyone would thank her for it. She was 34, medium height, with the kind of build that suggested she'd once done something physically demanding and hadn't entirely stopped. Her hair was dark and usually pulled back tight enough to mean business. Her face, when it was resting, read somewhere between calm and unreadable, which most of her colleagues mistook for vacancy. They thought she was slow. She was not slow. She had simply learned, a long time ago, the difference between reacting and responding, and she had paid a steep price for that lesson. She'd been at Raven Creek for 6 months, long enough to learn the layout of every supply closet and every shortcut between the surgical suites and the blood bank, not long enough to have made a single friend. This was partly by design. Carter, the voice came from behind her, sharp and carrying the particular tone of someone who used their title as a weapon. Why is Trauma Bay 2 still set up for a chest procedure? I cleared that case 40 minutes ago. She turned. Dr. Victor Hale was walking toward her from the direction of the surgeon's lounge, still in his dress shirt, tie loosened, surgical coat thrown over one arm like a prop. He was 51, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a specific brand of confidence that came not from competence, but from decades of no one ever pushing back. He had privileges at 4 hospitals. His name was on 2 wings of a children's ward downtown. He gave speeches at conferences about innovation and leadership in the future of surgical medicine, and he had never, in Emily's observation, once listened to anyone who held a lower rank than him. He was also, she had concluded within her first 2 weeks, genuinely dangerous. The bay's still set up because the OR requested a hold on the room, Emily said. They're bringing a second case down from recovery that might need a redo. I was told to keep it ready. Told by whom? Nurse practitioner Vasquez. Hale's jaw moved the way jaws moved when someone was deciding how annoyed they wanted to be. Vasquez doesn't clear my bays, I do. Break it down. I'll check with... I said break it down, Carter, or are you having trouble with 2-word instructions? She held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable. I'll take care of it, she said. He walked away without responding, which was his standard acknowledgement that the conversation was over and he'd won it. Emily watched him go. Beside her, Darnell Okafor, one of the ER nurses, 26, still young enough to be visibly upset by things, let out a quiet exhale. He talks to you like that every shift, Darnell said. Every single shift. He talks to everyone like that. Not to the attendings. That's because attendings can cost him something. We can't. She picked up the equipment tray and started breaking down the bay with the quiet efficiency of someone who dismantled things under considerably worse conditions. Go check on the patient in Bay 4. His BP was dropping when I passed 20 minutes ago. Darnell went. Emily worked. The monitor on the second floor kept beeping. Mess. The thing about Raven Creek that most of its staff didn't fully register was that it wasn't just a civilian hospital. It occupied a specific geographic and administrative gray zone that had existed since the early 1990s, when the VA system had partnered with a private health network to create a hybrid facility capable of handling both general population emergencies and military medical evacuations from the naval installations scattered across the Puget Sound region. The arrangement had survived 3 rounds of budget negotiations and 2 complete administrative overhauls because it was, when things went badly in the Sound or on the bases, genuinely necessary. Most nights, it functioned like any other ER, chest pains and car accidents and the slow, unglamorous disasters of civilian bodies wearing out. But every 4th or 5th week, a military transfer would come in. A training injury, a diving accident, occasionally something classified that arrived with an escort and a paperwork trail that got locked in a cabinet no one else touched. On those nights, the dynamic in the building shifted in ways that were hard to articulate. The military liaisons who sometimes staffed the admin desk stood a little straighter. The attending physicians chose their words more carefully. Emily had worked in one of those gray zones before. Not here. Somewhere considerably less comfortable. She didn't talk about it. Her employment file listed her previous work as emergency medical services, varied locations, and a 2-year gap that she'd listed as a personal leave. Nobody had looked hard at the gap. Nobody at Raven Creek looked hard at anything that wasn't immediately in front of them. She had understood very quickly that this was going to be a place where she kept her head down and did the work and didn't attract attention. She had a plan. The plan involved remaining invisible for approximately 12 more months, after which she had a tentative arrangement, nothing signed, nothing formal, to move to a trauma fellowship at a hospital in Portland where nobody knew her name at all. 12 months. She could do 12 months. At 9:15 p.m., 2 hours before the seal hit the floor, the night's first serious problem announced itself. The patient was a 47-year-old named Marcus Webb, transferred from a smaller clinic in Tacoma with a reported bowel perforation that had been downgraded twice by the attending who'd first seen him, and who had, in Emily's professional assessment after reading the transfer notes, missed something important. Webb was gray under the fluorescent lights, breathing in shallow pulls, and when Emily pressed gently on his abdomen during intake, he hissed in a way that made her stop and look at his face, and then look at the notes again. "When did the pain start?" she asked him. 3 days ago. He swallowed. "They told me it was gas." "Did they do imaging?" "X-ray. Said it looked okay." She ordered a CT. She documented it in the system with a note flagging the discrepancy in symptom onset versus the original assessment. Then she went to find the attending on duty, Dr. Priya Mehta, one of the ER physicians, who was efficient and generally trustworthy, and laid out what she'd found. Mehta looked at the intake notes, looked at Emily. "You're thinking sepsis." "I'm thinking we're behind the curve on it. His temperature's been low all evening, which can read normal on a quick check, but paired with the rigidity and the timeline, get me the CT the moment it's up." Mehta was already moving. "And flag for surgery consult." The surgery consult went through the standard channel, which meant it landed on the board in the surgeon's lounge, which meant Dr. Victor Hale saw it 20 minutes later and appeared in the ER hallway with the energy of someone who'd been interrupted during something he considered more important. He read the chart. He read Emily's note. His expression shifted into something that wasn't quite contempt. It was more like the particular dismissal a person reserved for information that arrived through the wrong channel. "Who ordered the CT?" he asked the room. "I flagged the case to Dr. Mehta," Emily said. "She ordered it." "Based on your assessment?" "Based on the patient's presentation, yes." Hale's eyes moved over her with the kind of attention that wasn't really seeing her at all. His original workup was clean. You're reading anxiety into a routine transfer. His abdomen is rigid in the lower right quadrant, and he's had a low-grade fever for— "I'll review the CT when it's available," Hale said. He said it the way you said this conversation is finished. He walked toward the patient's bay without inviting further input. Emily stood in the hallway. Darnell had appeared from somewhere and was watching her with an expression that said, "Don't." She breathed in, breathed out. She went back to her station and documented the exchange. Timestamp, exact words, clinical recommendation. She documented it because she had learned, at a cost she still sometimes woke up thinking about at 3 a.m., that the only protection you had in an institution was paper trail. The CT came back 40 minutes later. Marcus Webb had a contained perforation with early peritoneal signs that had been present based on the imaging characteristics for at least 60 to 72 hours. He went into emergency surgery at 10:45 p.m. Hale, scrubbing in, passed Emily in the corridor outside the OR. He said nothing. He didn't look at her. She was charting at the nurse's station at 11:32 p.m. when the radio crackled. Not the hospital intercom, a different frequency. One of the emergency channels that lived in a small speaker mounted above the trauma bay entrance and went months between uses. Emily's head came up before she was conscious of moving. The transmission was partial. Static, then a voice that had been trained to stay level under pressure and was losing the fight. Raven Creek, this is Nightwing Actual. We have 6. Repeat, 6. Critical casualties. ETA 14 minutes. Requesting trauma team activation. Be advised the situation is static. Then, be advised the situation is not contained. The charge nurse, a large, steady man named Pete Caruso, was already on the phone to the on-call trauma coordinator. Around the station, nurses and techs were moving with the specific acceleration that came before a mass casualty event, the internal gear shift from routine to emergency that bypassed thought and went straight to muscle memory. Emily was on her feet. She was already running the numbers in her head. 6 critical, 14 minutes, current available bay configuration, blood supply, which OR suites were clean, where the chest trays were, whether Meta had gone on break. She was also running a different set of numbers, a quieter calculation based on the words not contained, and the static that had eaten the transmission before the voice could finish the sentence. "What's the patient profile?" she asked Caruso. "Military transfer, combat injuries, they're saying." He was still on the phone. 6 critical, mixed trauma. "Do we know what kind of engagement?" He looked at her. It was the look you gave someone who'd just asked a question that was slightly outside the expected vocabulary. "I don't have that yet." "Okay." She was already moving toward the trauma bay to check the supply layout herself. "Make sure we have thoracostomy trays out, not just chest tubes. And see if we can get a vascular surgeon in here. Depending on what they've got, we're going to need someone comfortable with field improvised damage control." Caruso repeated the last part into the phone, and Emily caught the brief hesitation on the other end. The pause of someone recalibrating. She began laying out supplies in a specific order that her hands remembered before her brain consciously instructed them. The order she had learned not in any hospital, but in a series of forward operating positions in places that did not appear on documents that were publicly accessible. The helicopter came in at 11:46 p.m., not 14 minutes after the call, but 12, which meant the pilot had pushed it, which meant the situation in the air had been worse than the voice on the radio had allowed. They brought the casualties in through the trauma entrance in a controlled rush that was trying to be orderly and not quite managing it. 3 on gurneys, 2 walking wounded, being half carried by people in tactical gear who hadn't fully transitioned from operator to patient yet, and 1, the one who'd spoken on the radio, she would learn later, being rolled in on a crash cart with a medic maintaining manual compression on a wound in his lateral chest. The hospital staff met them. Dr. Hale was there, having been pulled from somewhere, his surgical coat back on, his authority reassembled. Meta was there. 2 other attendings Emily didn't know well, both competent, both visibly processing the scale of what had just rolled through their doors. Emily was there too. She positioned herself near the second gurney, a young man, mid-20s, with blast injuries to his legs, and something wrong with his breathing that the positioning of his body was trying to compensate for without anyone having consciously noticed yet. She reached past the orderly and adjusted the angle of the gurney. The man's breathing eased fractionally. "Who authorized that?" Hale's voice cutting across the controlled noise of the room. "He was splinting," Emily said. "His right lung is compromised. You need to get imaging on his chest before—" "Step back, Carter." "Dr. Hale, I said step back." He moved into her space, not physically threatening, but occupying the position of authority in the room with the deliberate intention of making her absence noticeable. "You're a floor nurse. This is a trauma activation. You don't belong in this bay." The room was not entirely quiet. There was too much happening for quiet. But the people nearest to them heard it. Emily saw Darnell look away, saw Meta's jaw tighten. She stepped back. 2 steps. She did not go further. The next 8 minutes were the controlled explosion that mass casualty triage always was. Rapid assessments, competing priorities, the sharp arithmetic of deciding who needed everything immediately and who could wait 90 seconds for everything. Hale ran it the way he ran everything, loudly, confidently, with the assurance of a man who had never been wrong in a room where he held the most authority. He missed the tension pneumothorax on the young soldier with the blast injuries. Not immediately. He would have caught it eventually. But the window on a tension pneumo was not a forgiving one, and he was focused on the patient with the most dramatic presentation, the one with the chest compression, the one that was going to require the most complex intervention, and therefore, Emily had noted bitterly to herself, the one that would carry the most surgical prestige. She moved. Not dramatically. She slid to the side of the bay where the young soldier was lying, his oxygen saturation dropping on the monitor in the way that would catch someone's attention in another 60 seconds or so. She had the needle in her hand before she fully decided she was doing it. 14 gauge. She knew the angle. She had done this in conditions that made this trauma bay look like a meditation retreat. "What are you doing?" One of the attendings, not Hale, one of the others, was watching her. "Needle decompression," she said. "Tension pneumothorax, left side. His trachea is deviating." She showed him, briefly, efficiently. "Tell me I'm wrong." He looked at the patient. He looked at her. He said, "Do it." She did it. The air came out with the pressure change that confirmed exactly what she'd said it was. The young soldier's oxygen saturation, which had been in a long, slow freefall, steadied. He took a real breath. His face changed. Hale turned around to the sound of that, the sound of a monitor stabilizing when it had been heading the wrong direction. And he saw Emily. He saw the needle. He understood what had happened in approximately 1 second and spent approximately 3 more seconds deciding how to process it. "Clear the bay," he said. His voice was very controlled. "Victor," Meta started. "I said clear the bay, non-essential personnel." His eyes were on Emily when he said it. Now. She was standing off the corridor outside the trauma wing at 11:54 p.m., with her gloves still on and a chart in her hand she'd been carrying for the last hour without having entered a single note in it. Darnell had come to stand near her, not quite beside her, but near, the way a person stood near someone they were worried about but didn't know how to help. "You saved that kid," Darnell said quietly. "Someone would have caught it." "In time?" She didn't answer. Through the trauma bay doors, which were not fully closed, she could hear Hale's voice directing the room. He had not mentioned what had happened with the needle decompression. He had reabsorbed it into the ongoing emergency as if it had simply been part of the standard course of care, because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging her, and acknowledging her would have cost him something he didn't know how to give. She was used to this. She had been used to this in places where the stakes had been considerably higher, and she had survived it, and she was still here. What she was not used to, what cut through the practiced calm in a way she had not anticipated, was the man on the gurney nearest the door. She could see him through the gap in the doors. He was the one they'd been maintaining compression on, the one from the radio call. He was conscious, barely, but conscious, and he was watching the room with the specific quality of attention that certain people developed when they had spent years in environments where failing to watch a room could kill you, and then his eyes moved to the door, and found her. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, given that he was bleeding through a chest wound and surrounded by trauma staff. And then he said something. She couldn't hear it through the doors, but she'd spent enough time reading mouths across loud environments to catch it. He said, "Carter." Not Nurse Carter. Not the Carter some of the attendings used when they wanted to sound informal without wanting to actually be informal. Just Carter. The way people said it when they knew who you were before you'd introduced yourself. She pushed the door open. "Ma'am?" One of the men in tactical gear who'd been stationed near the door moved to intercept, Not aggressively, but with the body position of someone whose job was to control access. This area is restricted. I'm on staff, she said. I understand that. Dr. Hale has cleared the, I need to speak to your patient. She nodded toward the man on the gurney. 30 seconds. The operator looked at her. Then he looked at the man on the gurney. Then, in the way that surprised her, though it shouldn't have, he stepped aside. She moved to the gurney, crouched to get to eye level with him. His color was bad, and his breathing was compensated, and he had the look of someone who was spending a significant amount of will on staying conscious. You know me, she said. It wasn't a question. Sierra 5. His voice was barely above a whisper. His eyes were clear, though, intensely clear. Falco OP, 212 Brigade support. Her chest went very still. That operation, that number. Nobody in this building had any reason to know that. Nobody who hadn't been there. That was a long time ago, she said carefully. Not long enough? He reached for her wrist, the same gesture as in the corridor, the same grip, but different now. Not desperation. Something more deliberate. They know we're here. The people who hit us. They tracked the evac. His grip tightened. Whoever's working in this building tonight, they are not safe. She stared at him. He doesn't know, the man said. His eyes moved toward Hale across the room, oblivious to the conversation happening 4 feet away. Your chief. He's got no idea what's coming. The monitors beeped. The room churned with controlled emergency activity. The rain kept hitting the windows with the same persistence it had been hitting them all night, indifferent to everything that had just changed. Emily Carter stood up slowly. She pulled out the folded square of paper from her breast pocket. She looked at the list of things that needed fixing in this building. Then she turned it over to the blank side, and she began to write. She wrote fast. Not the careful, documented notes she'd been keeping all night. This was different. This was a threat matrix, and her hand knew how to build one before her conscious mind had fully committed to the decision. She listed what she knew. 6 casualties from a classified operation. Ambush with tactical precision. The wound pattern she'd seen in the first sweep of the bay had told her that much. Concentrated, deliberate. The kind of engagement that didn't happen by accident. A SEAL commander conscious enough to deliver a warning, which meant he'd been holding on to it through the pain and the blood loss specifically because he needed someone to hear it. And now this. They tracked the evac. If that was true, if whoever had hit the team in the field had followed the medical evacuation back to Raven Creek, then this building had approximately no idea what it was about to become. She folded the paper, put it back in her pocket, looked at the trauma bay doors. Then she went to find Pete Caruso. He was at the charge desk, juggling 2 phones and a tablet, the controlled overwhelm of a mass casualty event written across his face in real time. She waited until he put one phone down and said, Pete, I need 2 minutes. Carter, I've got 2 minutes. It matters. He looked at her. Something in her voice or her face made him put the tablet down. Talk. She told him what the SEAL commander had said. She didn't editorialize, didn't speculate beyond what she knew. Just the direct content of the exchange, the operational reference that verified the man knew her, and the specific warning. They tracked the evac. Whoever's in this building tonight is not safe. Caruso was quiet for 4 full seconds after she stopped. Then, have you told Hale? Hale cleared me from the bay. That's not what I asked. I'm telling you because you have the authority to escalate to hospital security and the military liaison without going through him. She kept her voice level. If I go to Hale with this, he buries it until he can figure out who gets credit for acting on it. We may not have that kind of time. Another silence. Caruso was not a stupid man. He was a careful one, which was sometimes the same thing and sometimes the opposite. She could see him weighing it, the professional risk of going around the senior surgeon on duty against whatever he was reading in her face. How sure are you? He asked. Enough to be standing here. He reached for the phone. Dershmunt. The military liaison on duty that night was a Navy lieutenant named Dara Finch, 29 years old, stationed at Raven Creek on a 6-month administrative rotation that she had, until approximately 11:58 p.m., considered the most boring assignment of her career. She arrived at the charge desk inside 3 minutes of Caruso's call, still buttoning her uniform jacket, and she listened to Emily's account with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing what she was hearing against things she wasn't allowed to say out loud. "You said he used the phrase Falco up," Finch said, "and the designation Sierra 5, and the brigade number." Finch's expression did something complicated. "Stay here," she said, and pulled out a secure phone. She walked 20 feet away and made a call that lasted 90 seconds. When she came back, her face had rearranged itself into the careful blankness of someone who had just received information that required them to be very deliberate about what they showed other people. "I need you to walk me through the bay layout," Finch said. "Every entrance and exit. I need to know if we're calling a lockdown. That decision is above my pay grade, and it's being made right now by people with the authority to make it. What I need from you is the layout." She paused. "Please." Emily walked her through it. She did it quickly, efficiently, from memory. The trauma bay had 2 main access points: a supply corridor that connected to the surgical wing, a loading dock entrance at the rear that was theoretically secured but operated on a keypad code that hadn't been changed in the 4 months since a contractor had been through. She knew the code because she'd watched a supply tech enter it twice, and she made a habit of knowing things like that. Finch took notes, asked 3 sharp follow-up questions. Then her secure phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen and said, "We're activating a security hold. This stays quiet until I tell you otherwise. No announcement, no visible change in staff posture. I need you to act normal." "Act normal," Emily repeated. "Can you do that?" Emily thought about the places she had acted normal in, the contexts in which she had held a calm face over a situation that was not calm. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." She went back to work. Acting normal in the next 40 minutes meant watching the trauma bay from a careful distance while the medical team worked through the casualties with the focused intensity that mass trauma demanded. It meant charting the patients she was assigned with the same thoroughness she always used. It meant refilling a water pitcher for a patient in Bay 6 and checking the rhythm on the cardiac monitor that had been beeping out of cadence all evening and had, in the chaos, continued to be ignored. The monitor showed a PVC pattern that was benign but worth watching. She documented it. She flagged it for the next shift. She did the small, unglamorous maintenance work of keeping a hospital running, while in her peripheral vision, she tracked every person who moved through the trauma wing corridor that she didn't immediately recognize. 2 of the SEAL team's operators were posted outside the trauma bay, not conspicuously, but positioned with the kind of casual alertness that only looked casual to people who didn't know what they were looking at. Emily knew what she was looking at. She also knew they were working with impaired numbers. She'd counted the team that had come off the helicopter, and what they had available for active security was not what they needed for an unspecified threat inside a civilian medical facility. She did not share this observation with anyone. Not yet. She filed it. At 12:34 a.m., Dr. Hale found her. He walked to her station with the specific energy of someone who had completed a complex task and was now prepared to deal with the administrative debris surrounding it. He had blood on his coat, not his own, and the post-adrenaline flatness in his face that even people who claimed to be above adrenaline couldn't entirely suppress. "We need to talk about what happened in that bay," he said. She set down her chart, gave him her full attention. "Okay." "The needle decompression." He said it like an accusation. "You performed a procedure without authorization from the attending." Dr. Mendez was present and gave verbal authorization. "Mendez isn't the senior physician on this case. I am. And I had not assessed that patient yet. His oxygen saturation was at 81% and dropping." She said it without heat. The deviation was visible. If I'd waited for a full assessment sequence, we'd be having a different conversation. "That is not your call to make." "I understand your position." He paused. The measured non-answer clearly irritated him more than pushback would have. "I'm filing an incident report. You performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a military patient, which creates liability exposure for this hospital and for me personally. I want you to understand that." "I understand." And I want you off this wing for the rest of the shift. I'll have Caruso reassign you to the general ward." She looked at him for a moment, just long enough that he would know she was choosing not to say the thing she could say. "I'll need that in writing," she said. The reassignment. His jaw worked. "Excuse me? If I'm being pulled from a trauma wing during an active mass casualty event, I'd like the order documented, so that if there's a question later about staffing decisions and outcomes, the record is clear about who made which call." The silence between them had texture. She could feel it pressing against her like weather. "You're documenting everything," he said. Not a question. "I always document everything." He left without giving her the written order. She noted the time. She went back to her chart. At 1:07 a.m., the second problem arrived, and it came in through the loading dock. She almost missed it. She was in the supply corridor connecting the trauma wing to the surgical suites, restocking a crash cart that had been partially depleted in the evening's chaos, when she heard the dock door. Not the sound of it opening. The sound of it being opened the way someone opened a door when they were trying not to make a sound. There was a difference, small but specific, and she had learned it in a context where not noticing it had consequences. She went still. She was behind a shelving rack, partially obscured, not visible from the corridor and near the dock. Two men came through the door. They were dressed in civilian clothes, dark, practical, the kind of clothing that wasn't tactical gear but had been chosen with the same logic. They moved with the low center of gravity and the specific economy of motion that you didn't get from civilian life. One of them was carrying something under his jacket that created a profile she recognized immediately. They were not hospital staff. They were not patients. They were not here for any legitimate reason that she could construct. She did not move. She controlled her breathing the way she had been taught to control her breathing, which meant her body's instinct to do something was still there. The cold clarity, the fine motor narrowing, the threat assessment happening faster than conscious thought. But none of it showed. She was part of the shelving rack. She was inventory. The two men moved down the corridor toward the trauma wing, purposeful. They knew where they were going. She waited 3 seconds after they cleared her position. Then she moved in the opposite direction, not running, but fast, covering ground with the efficiency of someone who had mapped this building in her head and knew exactly which path was shortest. She went left at the junction, through the small equipment room, out into the secondary hallway that connected back to the charge desk. Finch was not at the charge desk. One of the operators, one of the SEAL team's men, was standing near the entrance to the trauma bay, and Emily went directly to him and said quietly and very clearly, "Two hostiles came through the loading dock 60 seconds ago. They're in the supply corridor heading your direction. One of them is carrying." The operator's posture shifted. It was a subtle shift, but she knew what it meant. He was already keying a radio at his collar. "How sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way people rarely did in this building, and made a decision in approximately 1 second. He spoke into his radio. She caught fragments. 2 tangos, corridor approach, civilian building, ROE, confirm. "There are patients in those bays," she said. "I know." "And staff." "I know." He put a hand up. Not dismissive, a gesture that meant, "I have this. Let me work. Get away from this corridor. Find somewhere that isn't a direct line of approach and stay there. I'm not going to Ma'am." His voice was quiet and completely serious. "I need you out of the line of fire. That is not a suggestion." She stepped back. She was already thinking about the patients in the trauma bays, which of them could not be moved, which were critical, where the choke points were in the room layout. The SEAL commander was still in Bay 1. The young soldier she'd decompressed was in Bay 3, stable but not mobile. 3 others were distributed across the wing in varying states of consciousness and capacity. She turned and went back through the equipment room. She was thinking about the supply cabinet adjacent to Bay 1, which was accessed from the corridor side and contained, among other things, the surgical instrumentation that had been laid out for procedures that hadn't happened yet. She was thinking about the crash cart positions and which of them could serve as improvised cover and which would create obstruction. She was thinking the way she had not allowed herself to think for 2 years, since she'd walked away from the work and the unit and the life that had built these reflexes into her. The part of her she'd spent 24 months carefully walling off was quietly, methodically, taking the situation apart and reassembling it as a problem to be solved. She told herself it was just the nurse part of her, the part that protected patients. She mostly believed it. The next 11 minutes were the kind of 11 minutes that never fully compressed into clean memory afterward. They stayed fragmented, sensory, stripped of the neat narrative order that only came later when you had to explain them to people who hadn't been there. She heard a sound from the direction of the trauma wing that was sharp and short and made the two remaining staff members in the equipment room go pale. She heard radio traffic from somewhere. Fragments, controlled urgency, the specific cadence of people who were trained for this trying to keep it from escalating past the point of containment. She was already at the door of Bay 1. The SEAL commander, his name, she would learn later, was Commander Rafe Aldridge, was awake. He had been awake, she suspected, for longer than his medical status technically supported, running on the same kind of grim determination that had kept him talking in the trauma bay when a lesser person would have been unconscious. He looked at her when she entered. "Talk to me," he said. "Two men came through the loading dock. Your team is handling it." She moved to the side of his bed, checking his monitor readings without making it look like she was checking them. His pressure was low but holding. "How are you doing?" "I've been better." His eyes were tracking her hands, her efficiency, her calm, the specific way she moved around the medical equipment. "You're not just a nurse." "I'm exactly a nurse." "That's not what I saw you do in this bay earlier." A pause, the kind that cost him something. Falco OP was a 4-unit deployment. Sierra 5 was the call sign for the combat medical attachment. 2 people in that attachment had your profile. One of them was a man named Reyes, and Reyes is in a VA facility in San Diego with a traumatic brain injury. His eyes stayed on hers. "So that leaves the other one." She didn't say anything. The file said she resigned under contested circumstances after the Mira Valley extraction. He let that sit in the air for a moment. Whatever the official record says, the people who were there know what actually happened. "Commander Aldridge," she kept her voice even. "Right now, I need you to stay calm and let your blood pressure do the same because you are holding together with what is probably inadequate pressure and one functioning lung. And I would very much like you to still be here when this building calms down." He almost smiled. It looked like it hurt. "Yes, ma'am." She checked his chest tube, adjusted the drainage position. He was stable in the technical sense of the word, which in this context meant he was not actively deteriorating, which was different from being stable in any meaningful way. From the corridor outside the bay, she heard movement, fast, multiple footsteps, the kind of controlled rush that could be her people or the other kind. She positioned herself between the door and the bed, which was not a conscious tactical decision as much as something her body did before her brain had weighed in. The door opened. Lieutenant Finch came through it. Behind her were 2 of the operators, and between them, not gently, were 2 men in civilian clothing whose morning was not going the way they'd planned. One of them had a zip tie on his wrists. The other was holding his shoulder in a way that suggested it had recently been introduced to a wall. "Clear," Finch said, which Emily understood was addressed not to her but to the room. She stepped back from her position between the door and the bed. She was aware that her heart was doing something complicated. Not fear exactly, but the aftermath of a state her body had prepared for that hadn't required her full participation. The deflation of readiness without release. "The loading dock is secured," Finch said. "We've got 2 in custody, and we're doing a sweep of the rest of the building." She looked at Emily, then she looked at Aldridge. Something passed between Finch and the commander that Emily didn't have context for, but she could see its shape. "She flagged the breach," Finch said to Aldridge. "She's the one who told us." Aldridge looked at Emily with the clear, exhausted focus he'd been sustaining all night. "I know," he said. The 2 captured men were being removed from the doorway. Staff were appearing in the corridor. Darnell, looking shaken, one of the attendings, a security guard who had arrived approximately 4 minutes after the crisis had reached its peak, which was about what Emily had expected from hospital security. And behind all of them, moving through the press of people with the confidence of someone who had never in his life considered that a room might not reorganize itself for his arrival, came Dr. Victor Hale. He took in the scene, the military personnel, the men in zip ties being walked past him, the lieutenant, Emily standing inside the bay she had been told to leave, next to the patient she had been ordered away from. His face went through several things in rapid succession. "What the hell is happening in my hospital?" he said. Nobody answered him immediately. In the gap, in the specific silence of a room full of people who had each, in their own way, just survived something and were still processing it, Emily looked at him. She thought about the incident report he'd promised to file, about the word unauthorized, about the 6 months of small dismissals, and the particular tone he used when he spoke to her, the voice of a man who had never genuinely wondered whether he might be wrong about someone. She thought about Marcus Webb, who was in post-surgical recovery right now because she had pushed past the first dismissal and made Meta listen. She thought about the young soldier in Bay 3, breathing steadily through the chest she had decompressed while Hale's attention was elsewhere. She didn't say any of this. What she said was, "There was a security breach through the loading dock. It's been contained. Your patients are stable." He stared at her. She turned back to Commander Aldridge's monitor. There was a drift in his pressure reading she didn't like, a slow downward trend that hadn't been there 4 minutes ago. She adjusted the IV flow and looked at the drainage output from his chest tube and understood, with the cold clarity that had been her primary professional tool for the last 6 months, whether anyone appreciated it or not, that the night was not finished. "I need a surgeon in here," she said. Not to Hale, to Finch, to the room. "His pressure's dropping. I think he's got a bleeder that the initial repair didn't fully address." There was a beat, one beat, where the room held still. And then Hale said, in a voice she had never heard from him before, a voice stripped of its authority performance, "What kind of bleed?" She told him, precisely, without softening it and without making it a challenge. Just the data, clean and fast, because the patient was the only thing that mattered right now, and she had not spent 11 years in medicine, 2 of them in conditions that would have broken most of the people in this corridor, to let a man die because she was tired of being underestimated. Hale was already moving toward the bed. For the first time in 6 months, he moved toward her assessment instead of away from it. She stepped aside to let him work. She stayed in the room, and across the bed, between the monitors and the controlled urgency of someone doing the job he was genuinely trained to do when he wasn't too busy protecting his own position, Hale looked up at her once. He didn't apologize. Men like him rarely did, not in the middle of a crisis, not with witnesses present. But the look held something she hadn't seen from him before, a fractional, reluctant recalibration. It wasn't enough, not even close. But it was the first crack in something she had been waiting 6 months to see. In the corridor outside, Lieutenant Finch was on her secure phone, and from the fragments Emily caught through the open door, the conversation had moved to a level above the base commander, above the regular chain, to somewhere that would send more people than the 2 operators currently in this building. The night had cracked open in a direction none of them had anticipated when the shift started, and in the space that crack had made, the shape of what was actually true about Emily Carter was beginning, slowly and without her permission, to show itself. She stayed in the room while Hale worked, which was its own kind of strange. Standing on the same side of a patient as the man who had spent 6 months treating her like furniture, both of them focused on the same problem for the first time without the friction of hierarchy getting in the way. It didn't feel like cooperation exactly. It felt like 2 people who happened to be moving in the same direction without having agreed to travel together. Aldridge's pressure had dropped to 88 over 54 by the time Hale got his hands on the situation. The chest tube output had increased in the last 8 minutes, not dramatically, but steadily, the kind of slow hemorrhage that was more dangerous than a fast bleed because it didn't trigger the same alarm response. You could bleed to death slowly and look almost stable until you weren't. "He needs the OR," Hale said. "I know." The second suite should be ready. He was checking the drainage himself now, recalibrating his read of the injury against whatever initial assessment had been done in the first wave of trauma care. His hands were steady. Whatever else was true about Victor Hale, his hands in a clinical context did not shake. "I'm calling it. We move him in 5. His coag panel from 90 minutes ago showed his INR was climbing. Hale glanced at her. How do you know that? I checked it when I came in. It's on the monitor. He looked at the monitor. It was, in fact, on the monitor. He had walked into the room focused on the pressure reading and hadn't pulled the full panel yet. She watched him absorb this, the fact that she had the complete picture before he did, and do something she had not seen him do before, which was move past it without making it about him. FFP and platelets before we go up, he said. Get pharmacy on the phone. She was already reaching for the phone on the wall. The next 4 minutes were the efficient, undramatic work of preparing a critically injured man for surgery when you have limited time and limited blood product and a team that has been awake and operating under stress for 2 hours. Emily called pharmacy. She spiked the FFP bag herself. She helped the OR tech position the gurney and checked Aldridge's airway one more time because he'd been in a compensated state for long enough that she wanted to be certain his respiratory muscle fatigue hadn't tipped over into something they'd miss in the transfer. Aldridge, who had been conscious through most of this with the grim, contained alertness of a man refusing to let his body make decisions for him, looked at her during the FFP hang. Carter, he said, don't talk. You're wasting oxygen. I need you to listen. You need to save it for after surgery. After surgery, I might be a different kind of conscious. His voice was low and effortful, stripped of any pretense. There's a third person. We came in with 6. You've got 5 in this wing. She went still, did the count in her head. He was right. She had been tracking 5. Where's the 6th? He didn't come in with us. He was separated at the extraction point. His name is Petty Officer Damian Voss. If he's alive, he would have found another way to contact this facility. A pause for breath that cost him. If someone's already been inside this building tonight, and Voss tried to reach out through standard channels, they could have intercepted it, or used it to locate him. She processed this quickly. A separated operator trying to reach a facility that had already been targeted, using communication channels that the opposition had potentially been monitoring since they'd tracked the helicopter. Does Finch know about Voss? She knows we're missing one. She doesn't know his status or that he would have tried to contact the hospital directly. His eyes were losing the sharpness she'd been watching all night, the pressure drop and the blood loss finally pushing against his willpower. If he calls, I'll be listening, she said. Go to surgery. The OR team moved him out. And so she found Finch in this hallway outside the bay, where the lieutenant was managing 3 separate conversations simultaneously with the controlled multitasking of someone who had just had a very bad hour and was not done having it. Emily waited until Finch finished the most urgent-looking phone call and then delivered Aldridge's information about Voss in the same clean, direct way she'd delivered everything tonight. Just the facts, no speculation, no softening. Finch wrote something in her notebook. We flagged him as missing at extraction. There's been no contact. If he's trying to reach this facility, is there any way to know if an inbound call was intercepted or redirected before it got here? Finch looked at her with the expression of someone managing a significant amount of information they were not at liberty to share. We're looking at the communication logs. How long will that take? As long as it takes. She paused. I'll flag it as priority. Emily nodded. She turned to go. Carter. Finch's voice stopped her. The 2 we took into custody tonight. They had a working knowledge of the building layout. Not perfect, but enough to know the loading dock access and the wing configuration. She let that sit for a second. That kind of information doesn't come from walking past the building. Emily understood what she was being told without it being said directly. Someone had provided the layout. Someone with internal access. You're looking at staff. We're looking at everything. Including Dr. Hale? Finch's expression didn't change, which was an answer of its own. Including everyone on duty tonight. You might want to keep that in mind. She walked back to the nurse's station with that thought running underneath everything else. The low, uncomfortable possibility she'd been not quite acknowledging since Finch had implied it. Hale was arrogant, dismissive, driven by ego and institutional self-protection. She had never considered him dangerous in a deliberate, external threat way. But she also knew from years of working in environments where the most damaging people were rarely the ones who looked like obvious villains, that competence and corruption were not mutually exclusive. She sat down at the station. She opened the shift log and started going through the facility access records for the past 4 hours. Not because she had authority to investigate, but because the records were accessible to charge staff for scheduling purposes, and nobody had told her not to look at them. She looked at them the way she did most things, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing what she was doing. The loading dock keypad had been accessed at 11:22 p.m. The helicopter had arrived at 11:46. The access at 11:22 was logged under a maintenance credential, a contractor badge that had last been used 3 weeks ago for an HVAC service call. She pulled up the contractor log. The HVAC contractor's access was single day. 3 weeks expired. The badge should not have worked at 11:22 p.m. The fact that it had meant either the system had an error or someone with administrative access to the credentialing system had reactivated it. She looked at who had system-level credential authority at Raven Creek. The list was short. Chief of Surgery held it. Hospital Administrator. IT Security Manager. She printed the log quietly, folded it, and put it in her pocket with the list of things that needed fixing. At 2:19 a.m., Petty Officer Damian Voss walked through the emergency room entrance. He came in the front, not the trauma bay, not the loading dock, the public ER entrance, and he came in looking like a man who had covered approximately 11 miles on foot through the worst of what Seattle's November weather could produce, with a GSW to his left forearm that had been field-dressed with something that was not a medical bandage. He was 26, according to his file, and he looked both older and younger than that at the same time. Emily was crossing the ER lobby when he came through the doors. She saw him before the triage desk did. The gait, the left arm held slightly away from his body, the specific quality of hypervigilance he was carrying that manifested as a stillness in his head and neck while his eyes moved constantly. She changed direction and went to him. "Petty Officer Voss?" she said quietly when she reached him. She didn't touch him. She understood the instinct that a person in his state might have if someone grabbed them without warning. He stopped. His eyes locked on her, and the threat assessment happened so fast it was almost not visible. Then, "You know who I am." "Commander Aldridge told me to listen for you. I'm Emily Carter. I'm a nurse on this unit." She kept her voice low and even. "You're hurt. I need you to come with me, but not through the main corridor, okay?" He looked at the main ER hallway, looked back at her. Something in how she'd said not through the main corridor had registered correctly. "Is it clear?" "It's been cleared. We had a security breach earlier tonight that's been contained, but I'd rather get you away from the public entry points until we've confirmed the building is completely secure." She paused. "Can you walk?" "I can walk." She took him through the side corridor, the one she'd been using all night as her secondary route, the one she'd memorized in her first 2 weeks because she liked to know where the non-standard paths were. He followed her without hesitation, which told her he'd made a quick decision about whether she was trustworthy and come down on the right side of it. She got him into an exam room in the east wing, away from the trauma bay. She gloved up and looked at his arm. The field dressing was improvised from what appeared to be part of a shirt, tied with practiced tension at 2 points to control the bleed. Not the way a layperson would do it, but the way someone who'd been trained would do it to themselves with one hand. "Through and through?" she asked. "Yeah, hit the outside of the radius, but I don't think it's fractured. I had full grip strength until about 2 hours ago. Now it's about 60%. Swelling's compressing the nerves." She was already cleaning the wound. "You could have a hairline. I want imaging on it." She looked up at him briefly. "How did you get here?" "Ran, then drove. Vehicle's 3 blocks north, see. I didn't want to bring it directly to the entrance in case they were watching the lot." "Smart." She irrigated the entry and exit wounds. He did not make a sound, which she appreciated, not because stoicism was impressive, but because it made her job easier. "Commander Aldridge is in surgery. He's going to be okay, I think, but I want you to understand that when I say I think, I mean it with a significant margin of uncertainty." "Understood." He watched her work. "You're not a regular ER nurse." "I'm exactly a regular ER nurse." "You knew my name. You knew not to bring me through the main corridor. You handled a cleared building the way someone with threat training handles a cleared building." He said it without challenge, just observation. "I'm not complaining. I'm grateful. But you should know that I know." She tied off the wound closure and reached for the bandage material. "How many people from your team are you aware of?" 6 total deployed. I was the rear guard, got cut off during extraction. Last radio contact I had was with the commander. He was wounded, but mobile at that point. He counted. I've been dark since 2100. All 6 are accounted for. You're the last. She finished the dressing. 2 hostiles were taken into custody in this building tonight. The incident's been escalated up the chain, and there are more people coming. She pressed lightly on the bandage edges to check the seal. You're safe. As much as that word means anything right now. He exhaled. It was the first time she'd seen his body do something that wasn't controlled. I need to reach my chain of command. Lieutenant Finch can facilitate that. She's the military liaison on duty. Emily stripped her gloves. I'm going to get her. Don't open that door for anyone who isn't me or in a Navy uniform, and if someone knocks without identifying themselves, there's a supply cabinet in the corner that locks from the inside. He looked at the cabinet, looked back at her. You've thought about this room. I've thought about every room in this building. She picked up her charts from the counter. Sit down. Elevate the arm. She went to find Finch. But the next hour was the grinding, unglamorous aftermath of a crisis that had been contained but not fully processed. The phase where the immediate threat was over, but all the consequential complications were just arriving. Finch reached Voss within 6 minutes of Emily's notification. The security sweep confirmed 2 entry points had been compromised and secured. The hospital administrator, a thin, harried man named Gerald Koss, who had been pulled from home at 1 a.m. and had not fully recovered from the shock, was on the phone with the Naval Installation Commander and looking like a man who wished he were somewhere else. Hale was still in the OR with Aldridge. The surgery had been running for 40 minutes, which was in the range Emily had estimated based on the bleed presentation. She was watching the OR status board from the nurses' station and doing 2 other things simultaneously, finishing her documentation from the shift, which was now a legal record of the most consequential night Raven Creek had experienced in at least a decade, and working through what she'd found in the credentialing logs. She'd run the access record past one of the IT staff who'd been called in for the security sweep, a young woman named Tess Farrow, who had the specific look of someone who had not expected her on-call night to involve any of this. Farrow had looked at the log for approximately 20 seconds before her expression shifted. This contractor badge was deactivated 31 days ago, Farrow said. Standard end-of-service protocol. I know, it accessed the loading dock at 11:22 tonight. That's not possible without someone reactivating it in the system. I know that too. Farrow looked at the timestamp, looked at the credential authority list. I need to pull the admin action log for tonight. Whoever reactivated this, it'll show. She pulled up a secondary screen, typed for a moment, then stopped. The color left her face in a specific way. What? Emily said. Farrow turned the screen toward her. The admin action that had reactivated the contractor badge had been performed at 11:04 p.m., 42 minutes before the helicopter arrived, and before most of the hospital staff had any knowledge of the incoming military transfer. The action was logged under credential code VC11, which was the administrative system access assigned to the chief of surgery. Victor Hale's credential. Emily looked at the screen for 4 seconds. Her face did not change. Save that, she said. Screenshot it, forward it to your supervisor, and do not mention it to Dr. Hale directly. She paused. Do you understand why? Farrow understood. She nodded once, tightly. Her hands were not quite steady as she worked. Emily went back to the nurse's station. She sat down. She was aware that she was holding a large, irregular object that had arrived in her hands without her having sought it, and that how she handled it in the next few minutes would matter in ways that extended well beyond this shift. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she could prove. She thought about Aldridge in the OR and Voss in the East Wing exam room, and the 5 other members of a SEAL team who had survived an ambush partly because she had not left the building when she'd been ordered to. She thought about the credentialing log and the timestamp, 11:04 p.m., and what it meant that someone with Hale's system access had reactivated a contractor badge before the military transfer arrived, before the public announcement of the incoming casualties, when the only people who knew a military evacuation was coming were the base, the helicopter crew, and whoever in hospital administration had received the initial radio notification. She pulled out her folded paper and turned it to a clean edge. She wrote the timeline out. Exact times, exact actions. No interpretation, just sequence. The sequence told its own story clearly enough. She was midway through the third line when Dr. Hale walked into the nurse's station. He had come straight from the OR, still in his surgical cap, gown half removed, the specific flat exhaustion of someone who had just done 2 hours of high-stakes work following an already long night. He looked like what he was, a technically capable surgeon who had just saved a man's life. He also looked like someone who had not yet realized that the room around him had changed. "Aldridge is out of surgery," he said. He was talking to the room in general, to no one specific, the announcement of someone who expected his updates to be received with gratitude. "We got the bleed. He's going to recovery." "Thank you for telling me," Emily said. He looked at her, something in her tone, not what she'd said, but the quality of how she'd said it, registered as different from the usual exchanges. Not hostile, not deferential, just level. The tone of someone who was waiting. "You did good work tonight," he said. It came out stiffly, the words of a man who was not comfortable with the sentence he was producing. The decompression, the bleed identification. A pause. "It was good work. I was doing my job, Carter." "The incident report you mentioned earlier," she said. "For the unauthorized procedure, are you going to file it?" He paused. "I haven't decided. I have documentation of the full clinical sequence, the timing, the assessment, the outcome. I've already sent it to nursing administration." She held his gaze. "I want to be sure we're working from the same record." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through something, the recalibration that had started in Bay 1 when he'd moved toward her assessment instead of away from it, now encountering new information that he didn't have the shape of yet. "What's going on?" he asked. Not aggressive, genuinely uncertain. "A lot happened tonight," she said. "Some of it is still being sorted out." Before he could respond, Lieutenant Finch appeared at the end of the corridor and walked toward them with the purposeful stride of someone who had a specific destination and no interest in being redirected. She was not alone. Behind her were two men Emily hadn't seen before, in civilian clothes that fit the same way Finch's uniform fit, which was to say, like people who wore authority the way other people wore jackets. They stopped at the nurse's station. Finch looked at Hale. "Dr. Hale, I need you to come with me." He turned, still holding his surgical cap in one hand. "I just came out of a 4-hour surgery rotation, Lieutenant. If this is about the debrief..." "It's not about the debrief." Finch's voice was measured in the way voices were when precision was more important than tone. "We have some questions about your system access logs from earlier this evening. It won't take long, but it needs to happen now." The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences that had populated the night. Not the silence of people managing shock or urgency, but the silence of a room in which something has just shifted on its axis, and everyone present can feel it. Hale's face did not collapse. He was too controlled for that. But she watched something happen behind his eyes, a rapid internal sequence she recognized as the look of a person who had done something they believed was covered and is receiving the first indication that it may not be. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. "That's fine. We can discuss it." Finch gestured toward the corridor. The two men behind her moved into position in a way that was not threatening, but was also not ambiguous. Hale looked at Emily. She looked back at him. She said nothing. There was nothing she needed to say. He left with Finch and the two men. His footsteps receded down the corridor, and the nurse's station was quiet. Darnell materialized from somewhere. He'd been there all night, a peripheral presence, the loyal observer, and stood beside her. He looked down the corridor where Hale had gone, then back at her. "What just happened?" he said. "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but I think it's the beginning of something getting corrected." She picked up her documentation from the station. She had 3 more hours of shift left. There were patients who needed care, charts that needed completion, a second-floor cardiac monitor that was still, improbably, beeping in its uneven rhythm. The building was clearing. the intensity compressing back toward the baseline of a hospital at 3 a.m. That exhausted quiet that was its own kind of strange. She started walking toward the second floor. She was halfway to the stairwell when her radio crackled. Not her hospital radio, but the emergency frequency speaker above the trauma bay door. The one she'd heard at the beginning of all this. The voice that came through it was flat with the particular compression of a secure channel transmission, and it said, "Raven Creek? This is Colonel Wade Morrow, Naval Special Warfare Command. We are 22 minutes out. We have a team of 8. Be advised we are responding to a security incident and a classified personnel situation at your facility." A pause. Then, "Be advised we have information suggesting there may be a secondary threat element that has not yet been identified inside the building. Repeat, your facility may not be fully clear." Emily stopped walking. She stood in the stairwell entrance with her hand on the door, and she looked back down the corridor. At the nurses' station, at the trauma wing, at the east wing where Voss was, at the OR recovery suite, where Aldridge was coming out of anesthesia with no ability to move or defend himself. And she ran the numbers again, the way she had been running numbers all night. The cold, fast arithmetic of threat and capacity and what was available to her. 8 people, 22 minutes out. She looked down at her hands. Then she turned around and went back toward the trauma wing, because 22 minutes was a long time in a building that wasn't clear, and there were people here she had not finished protecting yet. She moved fast, but not running. Running drew attention in a hospital at 3 a.m. in ways that created problems she didn't need. She moved the way she'd learned to move in places where the difference between walking and running was sometimes the difference between going unnoticed and becoming a target. The radio transmission had said may not be fully clear, and she was turning that phrase over as she walked, feeling the specific shape of it. Not is not clear. Not there is a confirmed secondary threat. The uncertainty was real, which meant Colonel Morrow's team had information that pointed in a direction but hadn't arrived at a confirmed location or identity. Something had come in. An intercept, a communication pattern, something in the data that the security sweep had kicked loose, and it was enough to flag, but not enough to name. She reached the trauma wing and stopped at the corridor junction. She looked at what she could see. The operator who'd been stationed outside Bay 1 was gone. Finch had repositioned people after the first breach was contained, consolidating the security footprint. Bay 1 was occupied by the post-op transfer prep for Aldridge, who was being moved from recovery to a monitored room. Bay 3 held the young soldier she'd decompressed, whose name she now knew was Specialist Kevin Tran, 23 years old, from Fresno. He was asleep. His saturation was 97%. He was fine for now. She was accounting for the rest of the team in her head, their locations, their mobility, their vulnerability, when she heard it. A sound from the supply corridor. Not the sound of someone trying to be quiet this time, the sound of someone who had already been inside for a while and had moved past the phase of concealment. She turned and walked back toward the sound, which was the opposite of what the operator had told her to do earlier, and also, she understood clearly, the only thing that made practical sense. There were no operators in this corridor. Finch was in the east wing with Voss. The 2 men who'd come with Finch to take Hale had walked him toward the administrative offices. The building's security had reoriented around the confirmed points of threat, which meant the unconfirmed point was temporarily uncovered. She went to the supply room at the end of the corridor. The door was partially open, not in the way it would be if someone had just come through in a hurry, but the 2 or 3 inches of a door held open deliberately so it wouldn't latch. She stood to the side of the frame. She breathed. She pushed the door open with her foot from the side, keeping her body out of the opening. Nothing came through it. She looked. A man was in the supply room, standing at the far wall with his back to her, working at the medication cabinet with a tool that was not a key. He was in scrubs, hospital scrubs, the standard color, the kind that could belong to any staff member. He was not large, not physically imposing, but the way he was working the cabinet was efficient in a way that required training to achieve. She did a fast visual sweep of the room. His hands were occupied with the cabinet. He had something at his right hip, under the scrub top, which sat slightly wrong over the shape beneath it. She said, "That cabinet doesn't have what you're looking for." He turned. His face did what faces did when they encountered an unexpected variable. A quick recalibration, not panic, the managed surprise of someone who is trained to handle unexpected variables. He assessed her in about a second and placed her, she could tell, in the category of civilian, non-threat. This was useful. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was calm, slightly accented. Mid-European, she'd guess, beneath the English. "I'm looking for the backup pharmacy supply. I was told it was in this corridor." "By whom?" "The charge nurse." He said it smoothly. "I'm the charge nurse on this wing tonight," she said. "So that's interesting." The recalibration in his face moved into a different register. He made a decision. She could see it, the same way she'd always been able to see the 3/4-second window before someone acted, and his hand moved toward his right hip. She was already moving when his hand started moving. She went left, not back, which was counterintuitive and also the reason it worked, and she hit the supply cart between them with her hip, sending it into his path and buying the half-second she needed. She grabbed the IV pole that was leaning against the cabinet to her left, heavy aluminum, weighted at the base, and she put it between him and where she needed him not to be. It was not elegant. It was loud. The supply cart went over and the crash was considerable, and he caught the edge of it on his shin and went down on one knee, and she had the IV pole against the back of his neck, not a killing hold, a controlling one, and she said very clearly, "Don't." He was still. She was breathing harder than she would have liked. "Hands where I can see them," she said. He showed her his hands. She kept the pressure on the pole with one hand and used her other to pull the radio from her scrub pocket and key the emergency channel. "This is Emily Carter, Trauma Wing Supply Corridor, East Junction. I have a third party in custody. I need someone here now." 30 seconds later, longer than she would have wanted, but this was a hospital, not a military base. One of the operators came through the corridor at a pace that suggested he'd been close enough to hear the crash before the radio call. He took one look at the situation and took over in the way trained people took over from untrained people, efficiently and without ceremony. He zip-tied the man's wrists. He removed the weapon from the hip holster, compact, suppressed, the kind of thing that had no legitimate presence in a hospital supply room. He looked at Emily, who had stepped back and was leaning against the wall doing the thing her body required after that kind of adrenaline spike, which was trying not to visibly shake. "Third one," the operator said. Not a question. Morrow's transmission said the building wasn't clear. She straightened up. "This is why." He keyed his own radio. She listened to him report it and heard, on the other end, the shift in the communication pattern that came when people with authority received information that closed a loop. The search that had been ongoing since the transmission had just found its answer. She picked up the supply cart. She righted it. Her hands were steadier than they'd been 30 seconds ago, which was something. Colonel Wade Morrow arrived at 3:31 a.m. with 7 people and the particular atmosphere that senior military personnel carried when they came into a civilian space after a serious incident. The compressed, focused energy of people who had been moving toward this building for 22 minutes and had used that time to build a complete picture of what they were walking into. He was 55, gray at the temples, with the face of someone who had been serious since his 20s and had kept at it. He came through the trauma entrance and went directly to Finch, who gave him a 4-minute briefing in the kind of shorthand that required shared institutional vocabulary. Emily watched from across the room, charting. She had been charting since the third intruder had been taken into custody, building the paper record, timestamp by timestamp, because she understood that what happened in the next few hours would be shaped by what the record said. Morrow listened to Finch. He asked 2 questions she couldn't hear. Then Finch pointed at Emily. He crossed the room. He was not a man who meandered. "Carter," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, an identification. "Colonel?" He looked at her the way Aldridge had looked at her. The look that landed differently from the way most people in this building looked at her, because it was the look of someone who was seeing what was actually there rather than what they expected to find. "Rafe told me about you," he said. Rafe being, she understood, Aldridge. Before surgery. He was insistent. He needed to save his energy for surgery. He also needed me to know who was running the floor when we weren't here yet. A pause. You neutralized 3 hostiles tonight. 2 flagged to my operators, 1 personally. I didn't neutralize anyone. I contained a situation until qualified people could handle it. He almost smiled. Almost. That's one way to put it. He pulled a chair from beside the nurse's station and sat in it, which surprised her. She'd expected him to remain standing, the posture of command. He sat like someone who was going to have a real conversation. I need to understand the full sequence. From the beginning of your shift, I have Finch's account and the security logs. I want yours. She told him. She was precise and complete, and she did not editorialize. She laid out the credentialing log discovery, the contractor badge reactivation, the timestamp, the credential code, and what it implied about foreknowledge of the incoming military transfer. She laid out the conversation with Tess Farrow in IT. She told him about the timeline she'd written on her paper and offered to show it to him, which she did, unfolding the paper and placing it on the nurse's station counter between them. He read it. He did not rush. When he was done, he looked up at her. When did you know about the credentialing issue? I identified it at approximately 1:40 a.m. I flagged it to Finch's attention and separately preserved a copy of the log with IT. Before or after Hale was brought in for questioning? Before. She held his gaze. I want to be clear about the sequence. The credentialing evidence came from an independent log review. It was not produced in response to Dr. Hale's behavior toward me, and the record of when I accessed and forwarded that log is timestamped in the IT system. Morrow was quiet for a moment. You anticipated that it might look retaliatory. I anticipated that in an investigation, the sequence of events matters, so I made sure the sequence was documented. He picked up her paper. He looked at it again. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. I'm going to need this. I made a copy. Another almost smile. Of course you did. The formal questioning of Victor Hale began at 4:07 a.m. in the hospital administrator's conference room, which had the particular irony of being the same room where Hale had, according to Gerald Koss, delivered a presentation 3 weeks ago about risk management protocols in military-adjacent medical facilities. Morrow conducted it himself, which told Emily something about the seriousness of what they believed they were looking at. She was not in the room. She was not supposed to know what happened in the room. She knew anyway, because Darnell had positioned himself near the corridor that passed the conference room for reasons he claimed were related to restocking the crash cart storage, and because the door to the conference room was not as soundproofed as Gerald Koss believed it was. Darnell appeared at the nurse's station at 4:43 a.m. with the face of someone who had just heard something that had rearranged his understanding of several months of his professional life. He's saying he didn't know what the credential reactivation would be used for, Darnell said quietly. He's saying he was approached 3 weeks ago by someone who identified themselves as a defense contractor running a facility audit, and that he authorized the credential as a professional courtesy, and that he had no idea That's possible, Emily said. Darnell stared at her. You're defending him? I'm not defending him. I'm telling you that's a possible account. She kept her voice low. Whether it's true is what they're determining right now. The credential reactivation may have been obtained through manipulation rather than willing cooperation. Those are 2 different things with 2 different legal outcomes. But he knew about the incoming transfer before the public announcement. Senior administrative staff receive those notifications routinely. The question is whether he connected the credential reactivation to the specific timing of the transfer and whether that connection was intentional. Darnell chewed on that. You sound like you're running the investigation. I'm a nurse. I have no role in the investigation. She went back to her chart. But I've been watching how information moves in environments like this for a long time, and rushing to a conclusion before the evidence is complete is how institutions make mistakes they spend years cleaning up. She said it calmly, and she meant it, and she also knew, in the part of her that was honest with herself about what she felt rather than what she thought, that she was not entirely without investment in the outcome. She had spent 6 months being dismissed by that man. She had watched him nearly let a patient die tonight because he was managing his ego instead of his caseload. The part of her that was still underneath the professional composure, a person with feelings would not have minded a very particular outcome for Dr. Victor Hale, but the part of her that had learned what happened when institutions moved on incomplete information kept that feeling where it belonged, which was filed under acknowledged and set aside. At 5:14 a.m., Morrow came back to the nurse's station. He stood across the counter from her and he said, without preamble, he cooperated with the credential request, willingly. The person who made the request represented themselves as a naval facility security officer running a routine credentialing audit, and Hale verified the credential over the phone using a number that the investigation is now confirming was a spoofed line. He paused. He was deceived. His cooperation was not with the hostile operation. It was with a social engineering approach that used his position against him. Emily absorbed this. So he's not a collaborator in the intelligent sense of the word. He was used. Morrow's tone was measured, not exonerating. What he is a senior medical officer who accepted an irregular credential request over an unverified phone line without following established protocol, and who then failed to log or report the action per the hospital's own security procedures. He made choices that were negligent at minimum. Whether they cross into criminal negligence is a question for the lawyers. And his conduct toward the patients tonight? The dismissal of clinical warnings, the near miss on specialist Tron, is a separate matter, and it's been noted. Morrow's eyes were steady on hers. The military patients under his care tonight are going to generate a review of his clinical decision-making. That review will be conducted by the hospital's medical board in coordination with our medical personnel command. It will be thorough. He let the weight of thorough settle. I want you to know that what you documented tonight, your notes, your timestamps, the specific incidents, will be part of that record. She held his gaze. I documented what happened. I know. That's why it will be useful. He straightened. I want to ask you something directly. All right. Your record, the 2-year gap, the contested resignation. He said it without drama, just the flat presentation of a known fact. Mira Valley. The name landed in her chest the way it always did. Not a wound exactly, more like the memory of a wound. The shape that remained after the original injury had healed into scar tissue. She kept her face still. What about it? I've read the official account. I've also read the after-action reports that weren't supposed to leave the command. Rafe Aldridge sent them to me 4 years ago with a note that said they needed to be in someone's hands who would know what to do with them eventually. Morrow's voice was even and direct. The official account says you made an unauthorized tactical decision that compromised the extraction of 3 personnel. That's what the official account says. The after-action reports say you made the only decision that would have saved any of them, given the intelligence failure that put them in that position, and that the unauthorized tactical decision label was applied retroactively to cover the intelligence failure rather than address it. He paused. The after-action reports also say that 2 of those 3 personnel are alive today because of what you did. She was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. The second-floor cardiac monitor, she had never made it upstairs to deal with it, beeped its uneven rhythm somewhere above their heads. The official account is what's on my record, she said carefully. For now. He held her gaze. Rafe wants a formal review requested. He has the standing to request it, and I have the standing to support it. What happens after that depends on what the review board determines, but the documentation exists and it tells a different story than your current file. She had not expected this. She had walked into this shift expecting, at most, another 6 months of keeping her head down. She had not expected any of this to be the night it became. She said the honest thing, which was, I'm not sure what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, Morrow said. Tonight you should finish your shift and go home and sleep for as long as your body will let you. He almost smiled, the 3rd time he'd come close to it in this conversation. I'll be in touch. He went back toward the administrative corridor. She watched him go. At 6:02 a.m., with the sky outside beginning the grudging transition from black to the deep gray of Seattle's early dawn, the trauma wing had settled into the quiet that followed crisis, the way silence followed a door closing. Not absence of sound, but absence of a specific kind of sound. The mass casualty energy had compressed back into the ordinary rhythms of a hospital that was still running, still caring for patients, still requiring the 10,000 small actions that kept it functioning. Emily was at the nurse's station, finalizing charts. She had been awake for 22 hours and could feel it in the specific way she felt long wakefulness, not sleepiness exactly, but a slight lag between perception and processing, the world arriving at her slightly behind schedule. Darnell sat down beside her. He had the look of someone who had also been awake too long and had processed too much and was arriving finally at the end of it. "They're keeping Hale out of clinical duties pending the review," he said. "Koss made the call an hour ago." She nodded. "Dr. Mehta's taking over as acting chief for the surgical floor." He paused. "She's already asked if you'd be willing to stay on in the trauma wing." "I'll think about it." Darnell was quiet for a moment. Then, 6 months. You've been here 6 months and I never... He stopped, started over. "I knew something was different about you, I just didn't know what. I was a nurse. I'm still a nurse. You know what I mean?" She did know. She also didn't have a version of explaining it that felt appropriate for 6 a.m. after the shift they'd just had. "I was trying to be invisible," she said. "I had a plan." "What was the plan?" 12 months here, then Portland, then nobody who knew my name." She glanced at him. "It needs revising." He almost laughed. Given everything, almost laughing was the appropriate response. At 6:18 a.m., Specialist Kevin Tran appeared at the door of the nurse's station. He was wearing a hospital gown and socks and had a saline lock in his left arm and the slightly bewildered expression of someone who had woken up from post-sedation sleep in an unfamiliar room and had taken a few minutes to reconstruct the night. He was also clearly, absolutely determined to be upright, despite the fact that his body was registering numerous objections. "I need to find someone," he said. "You need to be in bed," Emily said, without looking up from her chart. "I need to find the nurse who—" He stopped. He looked at her. Something clicked behind his eyes. "You." She looked up at him. "You're the one who—" He gestured vaguely at his own chest, at the site of the procedure she'd performed. "In the bay. You should sit down. Your oxygen. You saved my life." He said it with the directness of someone who'd decided that the usual social filters for this kind of statement were not applicable tonight. "I didn't know. I was half out. But I know what was happening to me. I know what that felt like. When I could breathe again." She held his gaze. "You had a tension pneumothorax. It needed to be addressed. The doctor was going to let me... The doctor had other priorities and a complex situation. He would have caught it." Tran shook his head, not arguing with her, just disagreeing with the graceful exit she was trying to offer. "I want you to know that I know," he said. "That's all." She held his gaze for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself with patience. Then she said, "Go back to bed, specialist. You need another 4 hours before anyone lets you sit up in a chair." He went. Not happily, but he went. She watched him disappear back into the bay and then looked back at her chart and did not examine too closely the thing that happened in her chest when he'd said, "I know," because it was 6 a.m. and she was 22 hours into a shift and she was not going to do that right now. She was finishing the last of the night's documentation when Gerald Koss appeared, alone, moving through the wing with the tentative energy of a man who had spent the last several hours being a peripheral figure in a situation entirely outside his administrative experience and was now trying to find his footing in the aftermath. He stopped at the nurse's station. He looked at her. He seemed to be looking for the right starting point and not finding it easily. "Dr. Hale will be suspended pending the medical board review," he said. "I wanted you to hear it directly." "Lieutenant Finch told me." "Right." He cleared his throat. "The incident reports from tonight, the clinical ones, the ones about patient care decisions, they're going to be part of the review. Your documentation will be included." A pause. "I also want to say that I was informed by Colonel Morrow of the role you played tonight, in the security incidents and in the patient care." He cleared his throat again. "Raven Creek will... I'll be making sure the record is accurate." It was not an apology. It was the nearest thing he could construct. given his particular vocabulary and his understanding of what had been done and not done in this building over the past 6 months. She accepted it for what it was. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left, and she went back to her chart, and she was nearly done. The last entry, the timestamp, the finalization of the record that would exist after this night was over, when her radio crackled one more time. It was Finch's voice, tight and flat in the way that meant controlled urgency. "Carter, I need you in the administrative corridor, now." She picked up the radio. "What is it?" A pause, the kind that preceded information that required context to deliver correctly. "Dr. Hale," Finch said. He's gone." Emily's hand went still on the chart. "He was released from questioning 45 minutes ago. No formal charges had been filed yet, so we had no hold authority. He was told to remain on premises pending the board review." Another pause. "His car is gone from the parking structure. His phone is going to voicemail. And we've just found that the personnel file of Petty Officer Damian Voss, the hard copy that was printed from the admin system during the security intake, is missing from the records room." She stood up. She was already moving. "Finch," she said into the radio, walking. "When was the last confirmed sighting?" 50 minutes ago, in the corridor outside the records room." 50 minutes. In a hospital where she knew every route, every shortcut, every door that didn't quite latch. A man who had worked in this building for 9 years and knew its layout with the intimacy of someone who had walked every corridor hundreds of times. A man who had, somewhere in the last 50 minutes, taken information about the surviving member of a SEAL team and walked out of the building with it. She was running now. She ran to the East Wing first, because Voss was the name on the missing file, and Voss was the most exposed person in the building right now. No tactical gear, one arm in a fresh dressing, sitting in an exam room because she'd told him he was safe. She hit the exam room door at a pace that would have alarmed anyone inside it. Voss was still there, on the table, forearm elevated, looking at her the way he'd looked at everything tonight. Threat assessment first, context second. "We have a problem," she said. He was already swinging his legs off the table. "Talk." "Hale took your personnel file. He's gone from the building." She was doing math as she spoke. 50 minutes of lead time, a man who knew Seattle, who had resources, and presumably a contact he'd been feeding information to all night. If whoever orchestrated the op tonight had your file, they'd have your home address, your emergency contacts, your family information. Voss went very still. "My sister. She's in Bremerton." "Does she know you were deployed?" "She knows I was gone. She doesn't know where." He was off the table completely now, IV lock and all, moving toward the door. "I need a phone." "Here." She handed him hers without hesitation. While he dialed, she keyed her radio. "Finch, Voss is secure in the East Wing exam room. His family in Bremerton may be a target. He's calling them now. You need someone on that address immediately." Finch's response came back fast. "On it. Do not let him leave the building." Voss was on the phone. She watched his face while he waited through 3 rings, 4, and the specific quality of his stillness told her everything about what those 4 rings cost him. The kind of person who held their breath for other people's safety without ever acknowledging that they were holding it. His sister picked up. She could hear the voice on the other end, sleepy and startled by the early hour, and Voss closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "Hey," he said, "I know it's early. I need you to listen to me." He gave her instructions in the calm, practical shorthand of someone who had rehearsed exactly this kind of call in the abstract and was executing it now with the muscle memory of preparation. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone who isn't uniformed law enforcement who can be verified through the local precinct number. Call him back on this number if anything feels wrong." He kept his voice level, which was costing him something, and when he ended the call, he stood for a moment with the phone in his undamaged hand and breathed. "She's okay," he said. "She's going to lock down. Finch is sending someone to the address." He looked at Emily. He had the face of a man who'd been running on adrenaline for 8 hours and was beginning to feel the edges of it. "Hale," he said. The name landed in the room like a specific kind of accusation. "He knew about me. He knew which file to take. He was inside the system all night. He had administrative access to the intake records. She thought about the contractor badge, the credential reactivation, the clean timeline of a man who had been played and had, knowingly or not, played along. The investigation would sort the exact shape of his culpability. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the file and where it was going. She went back to the radio. "Finch, does Morrow have a vehicle tracker on Hale's car, or any way to place him?" "His phone is still offline. We're working on the vehicle. The State Patrol has been notified." A pause. "Carter, I need you to stay with Voss and stay in the building. Let us handle the outside." She lowered the radio. Voss was watching her. "You want to go after him," he said. "I want to make sure you're secure," she said. "That's my job." He almost smiled, which under the circumstances was an act of some defiance. "That's not all you are." She didn't answer that. She pulled a chair next to the door, not in front of it, to the side, which was where you positioned yourself if you wanted to see what came through before it saw you. And she sat down and she waited, which was the hardest thing she'd done all night. They found Hale's car at 7:24 a.m., parked in a commuter lot in Burien, 7 miles south of the hospital. The car was empty. His phone was on the passenger seat, powered off and left behind deliberately, the move of someone who understood that phones were tracking devices and had decided at some point in the last 2 hours that he was committed to wherever this road was taking him. Morrow came to the East Wing to tell her personally, which she took as a signal of something, the shift in how she was being treated in this building, the adjustment in whose account of events was being centered. He had the look of a man who was managing a situation with more moving parts than he wanted. "We've identified the contact," he said. "The person who approached him 3 weeks ago was using credentials that traced back to a private intelligence contractor with a history of operating in that gray zone between legitimate defense work and what the lawyers call unauthorized information procurement." He said it dryly. "The organization has been on a watch list. Tonight's operation was their first confirmed domestic action." "Hale's contact," Emily said. "He knew who he was dealing with?" "We believe he knew more than he admitted in questioning. The social engineering story may have been partly true. The initial approach may have been presented as routine, but the file he took this morning was not a confused man's mistake. He knew whose file it was. He knew what he was doing with it." Morrow's jaw tightened. "He's been located. He turned himself in 40 minutes ago at a federal building downtown. His attorney was already there when he arrived, which tells you how much of last night was genuinely improvised." She absorbed this. The image of Hale that had lived in her head for 6 months, arrogant, dismissive, self-protective, but essentially comprehensible, was shifting into something with harder edges. A man who had looked at a system and found the places where his own authority could be leveraged, and who had made choices quietly, over time, that were not the choices of a confused man. They were the choices of a calculating one. "What happens now?" she asked. "Federal charges are being prepared. The stolen file, the unauthorized credential action, potential accessory charges depending on what the investigation develops." He looked at her steadily. "It will be public. That's not the military's preference, but the hospital board has already been in contact with legal counsel, and the story is going to come out regardless. We'd rather shape the official account than have it shaped for us." "And the medical board review?" "Still proceeding, independently of the federal matter." He paused. "The two tracks are separate. The federal case is about what he did to the security of this operation. The medical board is about what he did, and didn't do, to his patients." His eyes were direct. "Your documentation is the backbone of that case, Carter. Every timestamp, every clinical note, the sequence of the Marcus Webb case, the Tran decompression, the Aldridge bleed identification. It's all there." She thought about 6 months of folded paper in a breast pocket. The habit of documentation that she'd built not from optimism, but from the knowledge that institutions move slowly, and sometimes the only thing standing between a correct outcome and a buried one was a clean paper trail. "What about my file?" she said. "Mira Valley." Morrow reached into his jacket. He produced a document, not the original, she could tell, a copy of something official, and placed it on the counter between them. "Aldridge filed the formal review request from his recovery room at 6 a.m. this morning. He dictated it to one of my people with a chest tube still in and oxygen at 94%, which tells you how much he wanted it filed before he went back under sedation. He tapped the document. I co-signed it. The review board convenes in 30 days. The after-action reports that were kept internal will be entered into evidence. She looked at the document. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way you looked at something you'd stopped letting yourself want because the wanting had become too costly to maintain. It might not go the way we expect, she said. It might not, he agreed. Review boards are not predictable, but the record exists, and the people who were there are willing to speak. He paused. Reyes, from the VA facility in San Diego. He submitted a written statement 2 weeks ago. Aldridge reached him before tonight, before all of this. Rafe's been building the case for 4 years. She picked up the document. Callsign. At 9:15 a.m., Commander Rafe Aldridge was moved from the surgical recovery suite to a private room on the 3rd floor, with a window that looked out over the gray shimmer of the Sound on a morning that had given up raining but hadn't committed to anything better. He was in the kind of post-surgical state that involved tubes and monitoring and a ban on any activity more strenuous than conversation, and he was visibly chafing at all of it when Emily arrived. He looked better. Not good. His color was still the particular pallor of someone who had lost a significant amount of blood and spent 4 hours on a table, but better than the man she'd been watching hold himself together with sheer will for most of the night. "You're still here," he said. "My shift ended 2 hours ago." And yet, she set a cup of water on his tray table. "How's the pain?" "Managed." He looked at her with the clear, direct attention he'd sustained all night. "Morrow told me what happened after surgery. The third intruder, Hale." "Morrow talks a lot." "He talks to people who need to know things." Aldridge shifted carefully, wincing in a way he tried not to show and showed anyway. "He also told me about the review, that you saw the document." "I saw it." "And?" She sat in the chair beside his bed. She'd been standing for most of the last 10 hours, and her body was registering a firm opinion about that. "I spent 2 years trying to get small enough that no one would look at me," she said. "Get through the shift. Stay in the lane. Don't give anyone a reason to look at the file." "I know." And then one night the situation just didn't let me. She looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady when it mattered, and then later in private they sometimes weren't, and she'd gotten used to both of those truths about herself. "I'm not sure the plan was wrong. I'm not sure it was right either." "The plan was a response to something that was done to you incorrectly," Aldridge said. He said it without softness, just the flat statement of it. And the response made sense given what you had to work with, but it was always going to run out eventually. Because situations don't stay manageable. Because you're not actually the kind of person who fits in a small lane. He paused. "You know that." She did know that. She had known it the entire 6 months, the way you knew things you were trying not to act on. It had been the persistent background hum beneath the folded paper and the deliberate invisibility, the recognition that the person she was being was not the person she actually was, and that the gap between them was going to close eventually, one way or another. "The review might not go the right way," she said again. "No, it might not." He held her gaze. "Are you willing to find out?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a cargo ship was making its way across the Sound in the gray morning light, slow and enormous, and completely indifferent to the weather. She watched it for a few seconds. "Yes," she said. He nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that meant good. That settled, and then he said, "Now go home and sleep. You look terrible. You have a chest tube and a surgical drain." "I know, I'm still better rested than you." She stood up. She straightened the water cup on his tray table out of the reflex of a person who straightened things in hospital rooms. "Voss is on the same floor, room 318. "I know. He came down the hall an hour ago in his gown to check on me, which is exactly the kind of thing that would have gotten him yelled at in any unit I've ever commanded. So I yelled at him, and he went back." A pause. "He also told me what you did. The supply room." "I did what the situation required. People keep saying that about you tonight." His voice had shifted slightly, not soft exactly, but carrying something she wasn't accustomed to receiving from people in professional contexts. I'm glad you were here, Carter. I want you to know that. She looked at him. She let herself receive it, which was harder than it should have been. The lifelong instinct to deflect or minimize running directly against the part of her that was exhausted enough to just accept something good when it was offered. Get some rest, she said. I'll be back tomorrow. She meant it as a clinical statement. Somewhere in the saying of it, it became something else. The medical board convened in exactly 30 days, as Morrow had said. Emily was present for 2 of the 3 sessions, called as a witness in her own right rather than as supporting documentation, a distinction that mattered more than she'd expected when she was sitting in front of a panel of 7 physicians who were reading her name off a page and looking at her for the first time without the preformed opinion of someone who already knew what category to put her in. She told them what she'd seen. She told them what she'd done. She told them the clinical reasoning, the timing, the outcomes. She told it without self-aggrandizement and without false modesty, which was harder than either of those things would have been, because plain accuracy about your own competence in a professional context required a kind of steady confidence she'd spent 2 years suppressing. Hale appeared at the second session. He was in a suit, with legal counsel, and he looked like a man who had lost considerable weight in 30 days, and not by choice. The federal case was proceeding on a separate track. 2 charges had been formally filed, accessory after the fact being the more serious, and his attorneys were negotiating the shape of what came next in ways that were not yet public. What was public was his suspension. The board had continued it at the start of the first session without deliberation, which was itself a statement about how much ambiguity they found in the record. He looked at her across the room. She looked back at him. She had thought, in the preceding 30 days, about what she would feel in this moment, had tried to anticipate it, prepare for it the way she prepared for most things, by thinking through the variables in advance. What she felt was simpler than she'd expected. Not triumph, not vindication in the dramatic sense. Something quieter. The feeling of a record being corrected. The relief of a weight that had been distributed wrongly being redistributed to where it actually belonged. He looked away first. The board's findings came in writing, delivered to Emily and to the hospital administration simultaneously, which she understood was itself a statement about parallel accountability. Victor Hale's hospital privileges were revoked pending the outcome of the federal case. His conduct in the clinical incidents of the night in question, the Webb case, the Tran decompression, the Aldridge bleed, was found to constitute a pattern of decision-making that placed professional hierarchy above patient safety, and the board's language on this point was specific and unambiguous in a way that institutional documents rarely manage to be. It said, in the formal vocabulary of medical governance, that he had been wrong, and that the person he had dismissed had been right, and that the outcomes of that night had been shaped by the latter rather than the former. She read the document at the nurses' station where she'd spent most of that November night. She read it once, folded it, and put it in her breast pocket. Then she went to check on her patients. The Mira Valley Review concluded 6 weeks after the medical board. Emily had been told it would take longer. Review boards had their own pace and their own politics, and nobody had promised her anything except that the record would be examined. And so the letter arrived faster than she'd braced for on a Tuesday morning in January when she was in the middle of a training session in the trauma wing and had to excuse herself to the hallway to open it. She stood in the corridor outside Trauma Bay 2 and read the 2-page summary of a board that had spent 3 weeks reviewing documentation she hadn't seen in 2 years. The after-action reports, Reyes's written statement, Aldridge's testimony, delivered by video conference from a recovery room where he was still working his way back to full fitness. The testimony of a third operator from the Mira Valley mission who she hadn't known had been willing to speak and whose name on the witness list had caught her off guard when she'd seen it in the notice letter. The board found that the tactical decision she'd made at Mira Valley had been responsive to an intelligence failure that had not been accurately documented at the time. They found that the retroactive application of the unauthorized decision classification had been procedurally irregular. They found that her separation from the unit should be reclassified as an honorable administrative discharge under corrected circumstances, and that her record should be amended accordingly. They also found, in a single sentence near the end that she read 3 times, that the outcomes of the Mira Valley extraction, 2 personnel returned alive, were directly attributable to her decision-making under conditions that had not been adequately acknowledged in the original account. She stood in the corridor for a while. She was not sure how long. A nurse she'd been training, a 22-year-old named Petra Hollins, who was 6 months into her first hospital posting and had the combination of genuine aptitude and genuine anxiety that Emily recognized as the raw material of someone who could be very good at this work if the system didn't grind it out of her first, appeared at the end of the corridor. "We're ready to continue when you are," Petra said. "Give me 2 more minutes." Petra gave her 2 more minutes without asking why, which was one of the things Emily had noticed about her. The instinct to read a room and respond to it rather than proceed with her own agenda regardless. It was a skill that nobody taught explicitly, and most people never fully developed. She folded the letter. Breast pocket. She went back into the training session. The formal recognition ceremony, Morrow's word for it, which she found faintly absurd, happened on a Friday afternoon in February in the main conference room of Raven Creek Military Medical Center, which had been arranged with the particular effort of an institution trying to demonstrate that it understood the weight of what it was doing. Gerald Koss was there, looking like a man who had spent 3 months reconstructing his understanding of the hospital he ran. Dr. Mehta was there, in her new role as Chief of Surgical Services, with the grounded, undemonstrative composure of someone who had always known the shape of the truth and was glad to see it finally upright. Lieutenant Finch was there in full uniform, having been officially commended for her conduct during the incident. Aldridge was there. He had been cleared for limited duty 6 weeks ago and was in uniform for the first time since the night Emily had watched him rolled into the OR, and seeing him standing rather than horizontal was its own specific relief. Voss was there beside him, arm healed, the IV long gone, looking like himself in the way people looked like themselves after a thing had happened to them, and they'd come back through it. There were others, command personnel she didn't know, a representative from the naval installation, 2 members of the SEAL team who'd been cleared for travel. The room was not large, and it was full, and when Emily came in, she felt the attention in it orient toward her in the way she had spent 2 years specifically preventing. She stood still and let it. Morrow spoke first, briefly, because he was not a man who believed in lengthy preambles when the substance was available. He outlined what had happened in November. He outlined what the investigations had determined. He spoke Hale's name and the charges attached to it with the specific flatness of someone for whom the outcome was not a surprise. And in the room's silence after he said it, there was the particular quality of collective reckoning that came when an institution looked at something it had gotten wrong and acknowledged the shape of the error. Then he said Emily's name. He said what she had done, in the specific sequence it had happened, the web case, the decompression, the breach identification, the supply room, the credentialing logs. He said it the way you said things that needed to be in the official record, because that was where they were going, into the record, into the institution's account of itself, permanent and unambiguous. Aldridge spoke after Morrow. He was brief in a different way. The brevity of someone who had a great deal to say and had decided that most of it could be conveyed in fewer words than most people would use. He talked about Sierra 5, about Mira Valley. He did not sentimentalize it. He said that 2 people were alive because of a decision she'd made under conditions that the official record had misrepresented for 2 years, and that the record had now been corrected, and that he was glad to be standing in a room where that correction could be stated publicly. He looked at her when he said it. She held his gaze. Then it was her turn, which she'd been told about in advance and had spent a week deciding what to do with. She was not a person who had ever sought platforms. She had made her peace, imperfectly, with the fact that this one had come to her regardless. She stood in front of the room. She looked at the people in it, Aldridge, Voss, Mehta, Finch, Darnell, in the back row, who'd come on his day off and was trying not to look obvious about being moved. She looked at Petra Hollins, who she'd invited because she'd wanted someone in this room who represented where the work was going rather than only where it had been. She said, "I spent 2 years trying to be invisible because I believed the official version of events had more weight than what actually happened. That belief was wrong, but it made sense given what I had to work with at the time." She paused. "What I want to say, the thing I keep coming back to, is that the night in November was not exceptional. Not for me. Every person in this building on that shift did the work they'd been trained to do, and some of them did it under conditions that required considerably more than their job description asked for. She looked at Darnell. The invisible people in institutions are not invisible because they have nothing to offer. They're invisible because institutions make choices about whose contributions get recorded and whose get absorbed without credit. Another pause. I want the record to be accurate. Not because I need the recognition. I spent 2 years demonstrating that I could work without it, but because the accurate record is what protects the next person. The next nurse with a better read on a situation than the loudest person in the room. The next person who knows what they know and can't get anyone to listen. She stopped there. She had not planned what came after that sentence and found that she didn't need to. The room was quiet in the way rooms were quiet when something had landed where it was supposed to. Morrow stepped forward. He presented a formal commendation, Naval Special Warfare Command, signed by the installation commander, acknowledging her actions in November with specific detail in the language of official recognition. He handed it to her, and she took it, and she did not deflect it or minimize it, which was the hardest thing she'd done in this room. After, in the corridor, Aldridge found her. He was moving better than 6 weeks ago, still careful, the surgery leaving its fingerprint on how he managed the left side, but better. He walked with her toward the window at the end of the hall, the one with the view over the Sound, gray-green in February light. "What's next?" he asked. "Meadows offered me the trauma specialty position, senior clinical lead for the wing, with a secondary role developing emergency training protocols." She looked out the window, combined battlefield and hospital triage methodology, so that when the next helicopter comes in, the people here are ready for it. "You're staying." "I'm staying." She glanced at him. "The Portland plan was about hiding. This is something else." He was quiet for a moment, then, "For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth what I'd like it to be because 2 years is 2 years and the institution got it wrong. I'm sorry we didn't do better by you, after Mira Valley." She had thought about how she would receive an apology, if it came. She'd imagined several versions of how it might go, including versions in which she was gracious, and versions in which she was honest, and versions in which she didn't trust herself to be either. What she said was, "The people who were there are alive. The record is corrected. I'm still doing the work." She looked at him. "That's enough." He nodded. Something settled in his face. The careful, long-held tension of a man who had been carrying a piece of someone else's wrongly distributed weight and was finally putting it down. "Reyes wants to talk to you," he said. "When you're ready, he's been asking." "Tell him I'll call." She would. She'd been waiting for the right time and had begun to understand that the right time had arrived with everything else, that the particular kind of readiness she'd been waiting for wasn't going to announce itself with a trumpet. It was just going to be present one day when she looked for it. 3 months later, she was running the first cohort of a training program she'd designed over 40 hours of evenings and weekends, standing in front of 12 nurses and 2 physician assistants in the Raven Creek simulation lab with a mannequin on a table and a scenario pulled directly from the anatomy of what had happened in November. Not the names, not the specific people, just the situation, the decision architecture. The moments where the wrong choice was easy and the right choice required knowing what you knew and acting on it regardless of who was in the room telling you otherwise. Petra Hollins was in the front row. She had the focused, slightly terrified look of someone who understood that what was being handed to them was real. "The clinical picture is in front of you," Emily said. "The attending has already made a determination. You disagree with it. The patient's status is changing. What do you do?" Silence. The specific silence of people who were working out the gap between the correct academic answer and the lived reality of being a junior staff member in a room with a senior physician who had already decided. "Don't tell me what the protocol says," Emily added. "Tell me what you do." Petra raised her hand. Not tentatively. Fully, with the arm extended, the gesture of someone who had decided. "I document what I'm seeing," Petra said. "Timestamp it. Then I tell the attending directly. One more time, specific and clear. And if they don't respond, I go above them. And if going above them takes time you don't have?" A pause. Then, quieter. Then I do what the patient needs, and I document why. Emily looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said. That's right. She turned back to the simulation. The work continued, imperfect, pressured, full of the texture of real decisions made by real people in real time. Not clean, not cinematic in the self-congratulatory way that stories sometimes were. Just the sustained, unglamorous labor of people trying to get it right in a world that made getting it right considerably harder than it needed to be. She had spent 2 years making herself small because the system had punished her for being full-sized, and she had survived that, and she had come back through it into this room with this work and these people. The thing nobody told you about being overlooked for long enough was that it could hollow you out or it could do the opposite. Compress everything inessential and leave behind only what was actually structural, what was actually you. It had done the second thing to her, though it had taken a very long night in a hospital with broken monitors and a rain that wouldn't stop to make it visible. She was visible now. Not because she'd fought for the spotlight, but because the situation had required the full version of her, and she had, finally, let it have it. That was the lesson she gave her students every week, without ever saying it in so many words, because the people who needed it most were always the ones who could feel it more clearly than they could hear it. The moment you stop editing yourself down to the size the room expects is the moment you become useful in the way you were actually built to be. She picked up the scenario card for the next simulation. Again, she said, from the beginning.